What's going on, everyone? I'm back, and with week 3 officially in the books, you know what time it is. I have got my weekly waiver wire pickups just in time for week 4, so let's get right into it. Starting off with the quarterback position, this will be an area where there is definitely some focus this week, especially following the Jimmy Garoppolo injury and with bye weeks kicking up. So the first guy that I have on my list is a familiar face in Andy Dalton. He's appeared on these lists before, and for the most part, he's been putting together solid performances. 352 yards, 2 touchdowns, albeit 4 interceptions versus that Panthers defense. But look, all those interceptions are misleading. There were a couple where he just threw up. And, they really had no chance, especially the one at the end of the game that he kind of just chucked up and was up for grabs. So that number is a little bit misleading, but now he gets that Falcons defense that's been absolutely decimated by injuries. We saw what kind of shootout they had versus the New Orleans Saints. Now, I certainly don't put the Bengals offense and that of the Saints in the same category, but I do think that Andy Dalton can go ahead and have himself a very productive game, and I would probably prioritize him as my quarterback pickup for week 4. Next up, I've got Joe Flacco, who's going up against a familiar divisional opponent in the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, it is on the road, but look, that Steelers defense, especially through the air, has been getting exposed. We saw it last night. And Joe Flacco had himself a decent performance in week 3, 277 yards, 1 touchdown. It was versus that Denver defense, so do keep that in mind. I think he can go ahead. I'm not necessarily predicting a win for Flacco and the Ravens, but I do think he can go ahead, get his yards, get a couple of touchdowns in there as well versus a struggling Pittsburgh defense. Continuing on, I have got Eli Manning, and probably a name that a lot of people are scoffing at, but look, versus that Houston defense, he put up 297 yards and 2 touchdowns, no turnovers. Now, the good thing is he is going to go ahead, turn around at home, play that New Orleans Saints defense that we have seen has been struggling the first 3 weeks. And look, I do think that whether it's on the run game or whether it's through the air, the Giants are going to have some success. I can see this one being a shootout. Again, I don't necessarily predict the Giants going ahead and winning this game by any means. But look, Eli Manning, matchup-wise, he has a good opportunity here versus that struggling Saints defense. The last quarterback on this list is a rookie that is making his debut in Broadway Baker Mayfield, who has now been named the starting quarterback for the Cleveland Browns. And it was tough to ignore considering what he did versus the New York Jets, leading the Browns back to a victory following that Tyrod Taylor injury. And the fact of the matter is, he finished for 201 yards, didn't have any touchdowns, didn't have any interceptions, but he played on a limited basis, and he gave the Browns that ignition. So moving forward, he is going to be their guy. And look, I like the matchup this week versus the Raiders because, well, they pretty much gave up their best defensive player, and now they have no abilities to rush the passer. That's going to make life a lot easier for Baker Mayfield. Not only is he mobile, but he can throw that football. So I like the opportunity that he's going to go ahead and have. Definitely maybe worth a stash in some deeper leagues as your quarterback number 2 as well. Moving on to our running backs, this is definitely a shorter list, and this will probably be a trend that continues barring any injuries just because so many of these running backs have already been solidified. But the first name on this list is Javorius Allen of the Baltimore Ravens, who keeps finding a way to get in the end zone. This last week, he had 6 carries, albeit for only 7 yards, but he still had a touchdown. And then he had 3 receptions for 19 yards, and then again, 1 touchdown. So if you're a team that is absolutely desperate for a running back that has that touchdown potential, I would go ahead. I'd take a chance on Javorius Allen. He finds a way to go ahead and score those touchdowns. Now, beware, definitely, as far as usage goes, he is not a guy that you want to target. He is going to be live and die by that touchdown. So he definitely is the definition of boom or bust. But if you need someone that can potentially, be that difference maker and you're that desperate, Javorius Allen, not a bad name to consider. The second and final name on this list I have got is Chris Ivory of the Bills, and definitely the biggest upset of the week. I think nobody saw this coming. The Bills absolutely dominating the Minnesota Vikings. Chris Ivory was a big reason why. With LaShawn McCoy out, he was that workhorse. He had 20 carries for 56 yards and then 3 receptions for 70 yards. Now, obviously, the addition of Chris Ivory will be very dependent on the status of LaShawn McCoy. But similar to other running backs that we've seen so far, a guy like Leonard Fournette, a guy like Devonta Freeman, in those scenarios where the number one guy goes down, it is a good idea to have that backup, to have that handcuff, because he can come in very useful. And Chris Ivory, just based on pure usage, not a bad guy versus a Green Bay defense that's definitely not on the same level as the Minnesota Vikings or pretty much any of the other defenses that the Bills have played up until now. Shifting focus to our wide receivers, the name we have to start with here is Calvin Ridley, who absolutely killed it this week. 7 receptions for 146 yards and 3 touchdowns by the rookie. Now, let's be honest, this kind of performance won't be sustainable. Julio Jones, without a doubt, is the number one, but the fact of the matter is that Calvin Ridley is definitely establishing himself as the wide receiver number 2 for the Falcons. It's 2 straight weeks now where he's gotten in the end zone, something very valuable for Atlanta wide receivers, as we are all very well aware of. And now he gets another matchup versus the Cincinnati Bengals, where I do think that's going to be high scoring potential. And Matt Ryan has looked great. You know, it's been something I've been harping on. I think that entire Atlanta offense is going to bounce back. I think Calvin Ridley probably is going to be the top name to go ahead and acquire this waiver wire period. And maybe if you're not that high on his production, he is definitely a sell high candidate that I think a lot of wide receiver desperate teams are going to want to go ahead and have on their roster, so you can possibly capitalize on bettering one of your other roster positions by adding Ridley and then trading him. Moving on, I've got Mike Williams next, a guy that's been quietly putting together productive week after productive week, and this week 3 was no exception, as he went up against a tough Rams defense, but still put together 4 receptions for 81 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, it's easy to forget about Williams considering that Chargers offense has guys like Keenan Allen and Melvin Gordon on it, but Williams is quickly becoming that second favorite target for Phillip Rivers, and I think that's something very valuable. On top of this, the Chargers get a very friendly matchup versus the San Francisco 49ers without Jimmy Garoppolo. And we all remember what the 49ers were like last year without Jimmy G. Well, they were pretty much in contention for that first pick overall. That's how bad it was. This is a home game for the Chargers. I think all of those offensive weapons are in store for a big day, considering the fact that that matchup is so friendly, and that includes Mike Williams as well. Next, for the second straight week in a row, I've got Tyler Boyd of the Cincinnati Bengals. He finished this week's game with 6 receptions for 132 yards and a touchdown. And now a big reason why he is listed here again is because of the AJ Green groin injury. Didn't finish the game. Now, by all accounts, he's saying that he's going to play next week versus the Atlanta Falcons. But look, we've seen that with superstars this season. Leonard Fournette thought he would play, but he ended up missing 2 weeks. And if that happens with AJ Green, Tyler Boyd jumps up to one of the top spots to go ahead and target. He is a very viable and valuable wide receiver option, again, versus an Atlanta defense that has been decimated by injuries. The last wide receiver on my list is John Brown of the Ravens, a guy that all the hype in camp has materialized into a productive season. 5 receptions for 86 yards versus the Denver Broncos. And I think he's going to be the main go-to guy for Joe Flacco versus a Pittsburgh Steelers defense that we saw get burned on huge plays. He's got that speed, and I think he's going to go ahead, have a 100-plus yard receiving game. Now, we'll see if he gets a couple touchdowns or not, but I do think week 4 he finishes as the top wide receiver for the Baltimore Ravens. Go ahead, pick him up if he is still available. A nice flex option. Looking at our tight end names next, I want to start with Tyler Eifert. And again, this is going to be very much so predicated on whether AJ Green is able to play or not. Even if he plays, I would venture to say he won't be 100%. And again, I'm going to keep harping on this. That Atlanta defense is absolutely decimated. I think it's going to be a high-scoring affair. The likely scenario here is that the Atlanta Falcons offense puts up a lot of points, and as a result, the Bengals have to throw it around a bunch. Eifert finished with 6 receptions for 74 yards versus the Carolina Panthers. His usage is trending in the right direction, and again, if AJ Green doesn't play in this game, Tyler Eifert, in my opinion, becomes a top 5 tight end for this week. Next, I have got Dallas Goedert of the Philadelphia Eagles. He had a big coming out party, 7 receptions for 73 yards and a touchdown. Now, this week, the defensive matchup is definitely tougher versus the Tennessee Titans. But the fact of the matter is, I do like Goedert because I think Carson Wentz really likes his tight ends. And Goedert is a guy that can go ahead, has that natural pass catching abilities. Him along with Zach Ertz, I think that's a heck of a combination. Now, obviously, Zach Ertz is the #1 option, but I do think Goedert can be a guy that has that nice touchdown potential, especially usage in the red zone. We saw promising signs in week 3. I do think they will continue as the season goes on, a guy that's worth taking a flyer on. The final name on this tight end list, but definitely someone to go ahead and keep your eye out for, is David Njoku of the Cleveland Browns. He might have only finished for 2 receptions and 36 yards versus the Jets, but look, the decision to go ahead and go with Baker Mayfield for the Browns is something that I think is going to positively affect the stock of Njoku. Because who's the best friend, that safety blanket for a new quarterback? It is the tight end. And Njoku, along with Jarvis Landry, I think are probably the 2 most experienced and trustworthy pass catchers on an offense, and that bodes well not only for Landry, but also for David Njoku moving forward, along with having a very favorable matchup versus that Raiders defense that has had so much trouble doing anything positively since the departure of Khalil Mack. Now, finally getting to our defenses, there are actually several good streaming options this week, starting with the Seattle Seahawks, who go on the road versus a very struggling Arizona Cardinals offense. And look, I know that the Seattle team isn't the same when it's on the road versus at home, but the fact of the matter is Josh Rosen is going to be the starter for the Arizona Cardinals, and I still think that that Seattle defense has enough playmakers to make it a long day for Rosen. These 2 teams usually play each other very hard, very close-fought games, and usually low scoring. I think that's going to be something that plays out similarly this upcoming week, and that's going to be beneficiary not only for the Seattle Seahawks, but also for the next team that we will be talking about. As promised, the second team on this list is none other than the Arizona Cardinals, the team that's going to be going up against the Seattle Seahawks. But look, like I said, these 2 defenses play each other very tough and very low-scoring affairs. I think the same logic that we had for the Seattle defense having a good game can be applied for the Arizona Cardinals. That Seattle offense just doesn't play the same way when it's at home versus when it's on the road. They're still missing guys like Doug Baldwin. We'll see if Chris Carson can be as effective. And while I do think Seattle will eventually come out on top, I do think it'll be a low-scoring affair. And the Arizona Cardinals defense is a decent option to go ahead and stream this week. Moving on, I have got the LA Chargers defense next, and this would be a great defense to go ahead and target this week because they are going up against the San Francisco 49ers, and this is going to be without Jimmy Garoppolo. That is the difference maker here. We all know what the 49ers were last year without Garoppolo. I mentioned it. They were at the bottom of the league, and that offense totally takes a big hit everywhere. Running backs, wide receivers, tight ends. And I think the Chargers are going ahead and take big advantage of that. I love the Chargers defense upside this week for a San Francisco team that has lost their main playmaker, their leader in Jimmy Garoppolo. The last defense on this list is the Green Bay Packers. And look, they're going to be playing the Buffalo Bills. And even though Buffalo pulled out one of the biggest upsets that we've seen in recent memory, they are still led by a rookie quarterback on the road at Lambeau Field. I think that's going to go ahead and limit the production. And honestly, I still like the Green Bay defense and other defenses moving forward versus the Buffalo Bills. I do think in large part what happened this last week with Minnesota can be labeled as a fluke. Nobody saw that coming. That Minnesota Vikings defense didn't look like itself at all. Neither did that offense. And I do think that Green Bay Packers defense is going to go ahead, be able to get you at least somewhere between 8 to 10 points versus the Buffalo Bills. So with that, we come to an end of this waiver wire target list. And as always, let me know what you guys thought. Did you agree with the additions here? Are there names that you think I should have included on top of this? If you have any other questions, let me hear it in the comments section. And as always, if you enjoyed, make sure to like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in future videos.